The Egyptians were the teachers of the Greeks, and no one really considered the Greeks serious as philosophers, for instance, and Socrates and Plato and these people had transmitted elements of their philosophy.
There is often a great debate about the true originators of the classical civilizations in history. In truth, it is not a mystery that Africans were the originators of civilization. Archaeologists have known this for centuries, but somehow it hasn't made it to our history books. Once you realize how widespread and influential the Africans were to the classical civilizations, you will understand that it is the puzzle piece that ties all ancient civilizations together. From the Natufians, who invented agriculture, to the Sumerians, the writers of the Epic of Gilgamesh, to the Phoenicians, the great seafarers who invented our modern writing system, to the Carthaginians who almost wiped out the Romans, the Garamantes, to the Etruscans who invented everything that the Romans inherited, to the ancient Egyptians, to the Pelasgians, the early Greeks, to the ancient Chinese and the Mesoamerican, and more. As we go through this study, please keep this in mind. Showing that Africans ignited the spark of civilization after the great reboot of the Younger Dryas 12,000 years ago does not mean that other peoples were not capable of civilization building. Far from that. If anything, it fills in the historical and logical gap that our current narrative of history has imposed onto us. There is so much evidence of Africans birthing great civilizations and spreading that I will leave a ton of sources for those who want to explore more. Towards the end of the video, we will also address the burning question that so many have asked. The question that explains it all and ties everything together, that same question that we see posted everywhere online. If Africans were at the seat of civilization and dominated so much in antiquity, how come a lot of the Africans today are at the bottom of the economic ladder? But for now, let us go back, all the way to the beginning, the place where it all started, with the one invention that changed the course of human history for good. And we will see how, since that invention, we have had an unbroken line of civilization evolution. It was agriculture that really kick-started it all. It took us out of the hunter-gatherer mode to an agrarian society with job specialization. Life for humans at the end of the last ice age, before the Younger Dryas event, was marked by significant changes and challenges. The last ice age, also known as the Pleistocene epoch, lasted from about 2.6 million years ago to around 11,700 years ago, ending with the onset of the Holocene epoch. The period just before the Younger Dryas, which occurred between 19,000 and 11,000 years ago, saw the retreat of massive ice sheets, leading to a warmer and more stable climate. The climate was gradually warming, leading to the melting of large ice sheets that had covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. As the ice melted, sea levels rose, flooding coastal areas and creating new shorelines. The retreating ice transformed landscapes, creating new habitats for plants and animals. Forests began to spread, and grasslands developed in some regions. One of the areas that benefited the most from this changing climate was the Fertile Crescent. The last ice age had a remarkable impact on the soil fertility of the Fertile Crescent, which is a region in the Middle East that borders the eastern flank of the Mediterranean Sea, covering parts of modern-day Egypt, Iraq, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. Take note of this, as it will become important when we trace back civilizations. This combination of fertile soil and the availability of water from the Nile, the Tigris, Euphrates, and the ancient Sahara River networks created ideal conditions for agriculture, supporting the growth of early civilizations in the Fertile Crescent and North Africa. So, in 12,000 BC, in modern-day Syria, the first true civilization appeared. Thanks to the discovery of agriculture, humans, and now able to undertake projects which would have previously been impossible in a hunter-gatherer society. These early agriculturalists were called the Natufians. The Natufians played a crucial role in the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural communities. Living in the Levant region of the Middle East around 12,000 to 9,500 BCE, the Natufians are considered one of the first groups to practice early forms of agriculture. The Natufians settled in permanent or semi-permanent villages, a major shift from the nomadic lifestyle of earlier hunter-gatherer groups. This was possible due to the abundance of wild cereals and other resources in the region. They began cultivating and harvesting wild varieties of wheat and barley, and they also stored these grains, demonstrating an early form of agricultural practice. They engaged in the systematic collection of wild cereals, which is considered a precursor to full-scale agriculture, and they invented a number of tools to assist them. This included sickles with flint blades for harvesting cereals and stone mortars and pestles for grinding grains. So, what does the research say about the Natufians and their genetic makeup? In 2009, researchers from the Department of Anthropology of the University of Florida made a startling discovery. The paper attests that the Semitic language, in fact, has its roots in all the African languages. And I quote, "These results indicate that the ancestor of all Semitic languages in our dataset was being spoken in the Near East no earlier than approximately 7400 YBP, after having diverged from Afro-Asiatic in Africa." End quote. Here is a chart that depicts the evolution of Semitic languages, and notice their origin. So in short, well into the Stone Age, Afro-Asiatic originated in Africa and fanned out towards the Levant, before further branching out into the various Semitic languages that we know. Interestingly enough, the evolution of these languages matches exactly the evolution and root of haplogroup E. And this is what researchers from the University of Michigan confirmed in the 2005 paper, where they showed that Natufians had clear sub-Saharan African linkage. And I quote, "It is a further surprise that the Epipaleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa." End quote. They also go on to add that the small Natufian sample falls between the Niger-Congo group and the other samples used. In fact, proximity-similarity analysis shows that Niger-Congo languages are the most closely related languages to Natufian. Let me repeat that. Niger-Congo languages are the most closely related languages to Natufian. As you can also see, canonical variate analysis shows that Natufian sits between Niger-Congo and prehistoric North Africa. So it would have sounded like a merging of both these languages. We will see later on who the prehistoric North Africans were. For now, it suffices to say that they were also black Africans. So this is a reconstruction of a Natufian from Jericho. I like this facial reconstruction as it shows that he looks exactly like Common. So the high prevalence of E1b1 haplogroup that we see in the Levant and some part of the Fertile Crescent is in fact a testament to the African expansion of civilization. Its highest historical concentration is in the Niger-Congo, and it spreads out towards the Levant to become the Natufian, before becoming, much later on, absorbed by the immigrant populations. There are plenty of scholarly articles that validate this fact. I won't cite them all. But here is one interesting publication from the New York Times nonetheless, where the Natufians are described as a Negroid people by Sir Arthur, with wide faces, flat noses, and long, large heads. In other words, the typical African. Skeletal remains of those practicing the Natufian culture date from the transition from the Neolithic to the Paleolithic. The Natufians were of medium stature. Their skulls were also dolichocephalic, with broad, short faces, and a tendency towards prognathism. This was clarified in the book Paleopathology and the Origins of Agriculture by Mark Nathan Cohen and George G. Amalagas. Both dolichocephaly and prognathism are key traits of African populations. Dr. Joseph Lizaridis and Dr. Nadine Roland from Harvard performed extensive genetic tests on Natufian archaeological remains. And this is what they found. Natufians had clear African DNA markers without any Neanderthal admixture. It isn't too long after that, the Natufians propagated the idea of agriculture and their technology to the rest of the Fertile Crescent and the Nile Valley. And it is there, a few millennia later, that their descendants would kickstart the two most influential civilizations in history. And we will start by finding out who were those that started the smaller of these civilizations. Sumer. I am a strong subscriber to the value for value model. If you feel that this channel has brought you and your loved ones some value, I would be immensely grateful if you would consider returning that value in any way you can. Either in the form of subscriptions to the channel or Patreon, or through sharing it with others so we can get the word out. As one of the most influential civilizations in history, the Sumerians need no introduction. Authors of the Epic of Gilgamesh, excellent mathematicians and astronomers, they are even said to have invented the wheel and invented our way of telling time, with the 60 seconds and 60 minutes hour. Since the archaeological discovery of this civilization, it has been assumed that ancient Sumerians resembled modern inhabitants of the region. We now understand that to be false. In fact, Sumerians, especially early Sumerians, those who established the foundation of the civilization, from writing to religion to the wheel and more, those founding population of Sumer were what we would call Black African. And this has been known for 200 years, but not publicly shared. We already saw how carriers of the E1B1 marker, coming out of the last ice age and entering the Bronze Age, invented agriculture in the Levant and then spread out. In fact, there is interesting research that is now emerging that suggests that the Natufians may have very well been behind the building of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. Researcher Dr. Dorothy Garrod attests that the Natufians who were living in the Middle East since 13,000 BC would have been behind the construction of Göbekli Tepe soon after the Holocene period began. Although more research on this subject needs to be done, it stands to reason that the Natufians would have had the agricultural backing and specialization sophistication necessary to build the sites. As to the identity of the Sumerians and where they hailed from, it was made clear by Albert Terrien de la Couperie. Born in France, de la Couperie was a well-known linguist and China expert. Although native of France, most of his writings are in English. In the journal he published called The Babylonian and Oriental Record, he outlined many aspects of ancient history. In these pages he made it clear that the Sumerians, Akkadians, and even the Assyrians, who called themselves Shalmat Kakadi, black-headed people, were all blacks of Kushite origin. So then, one might ask, why is it that the majority of the depictions of the Sumerians that we see are Semite and Caucasians? And never do we see the African phenotypes that actually started the civilization. To make the Sumerians Europeans, textbooks print pictures of artifacts dating to the Gutian rule of Lagash, to pass them off as the true originators of Sumerian civilization. No Gutian rulers of Lagash are recognized in the Sumerian king list. One of the most notable of these ancient reliefs is the victory stele of Naram Sin, the third Akkadian king. According to Dr. Wesley Muhammad, the stele depicts Naram Sin's military victory over a Negrito people in the Zagros Mountains plain of Iran. This, along with the Narmer Palette, are amongst my all-time favorite steles. Admire already the refined details on this sculpture. Notice the ornate attire of Naram Sin, his scepter and bow. Of particular interest, we notice how the people of Zagros sport typical Afros and Afro phenotypes. So, not only the Akkadian were black African, but the surrounding people were also phenotypically African. All this follows exactly the genetic and linguistic evidence that we have reviewed earlier. So what about the early first cities of Mesopotamia? Who started them? After genetic and linguistic evidence, perhaps the best evidence of black Africans starting the Sumerian civilization are the cranial classifications found in the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia. The British Museum of Natural History holds the largest collection of Kish remains. These were analyzed and classified by anthropologist Faris Supia using Fordisk 2.0 to determine the affinities of the individuals and the population as a whole. Fordisk 2.0, the forensic discriminant program, enables precise classification of the ethnic origin given a cranial sample. Notice here that the reading of Egyptian refers to the Nubio-Kemetic stocks, which we have already seen, is indistinguishable from Africans living south of the Sahara. Same goes for other non-Eurasian classifications that are directly attributable to Africans. And it shows clearly that the predominant associations were African, as you can see on the summary table of the analysis. Furthermore, consistent with the previous data, the presence of non-African stock starts to increase only in the late period. This shows that just like in the ancient Nubio-Kemet, millennia after the Africans had established the civilization along with all its defining elements, surrounding people not only started to immigrate to Kish and the rest of Mesopotamia, but invaders also brought in new people who over centuries inherited the science, culture, and land of the Kishites, Babylonians, and Akkadians. So far, we have seen how the Natufians, who were black, branched off into the Levant and North Africa, where they expanded their agricultural practices into grandiose civilizations. They also went westward to establish another mysterious civilization in the most unlikely of places. Our journey continues in Libya's southern edge. In the 1960s, an astonishing find was unveiled, the preserved remains of a young boy called Uwan Muhujaj. Back then, the Sahara was a lush and green savanna. Today, Libya is distinctively Middle Eastern. However, in 3600 BC bore witness to a southern Libya inhabited by black Africans, a fact inferred from DNA studies and copious rock art across the ancient Sahara. The genetic analysis of Uwan Muhujaj not only confirmed these findings, but also shed light on a previously unknown African culture. The sophistication of the mummification process of the young boy showed that already in Western Sahara, the West Africans had already mastered that science. But they didn't just leave mummies. They also left stone constructions that scientists are still studying today. It is even stipulated that the famous Eye of the Sahara might be one of the relics of this once ancient and glorious civilization. Western Sahara is still one of the least studied areas in archaeology. The harsh climate and the rampant insecurity of the region means that many of its secrets are still to be revealed. Approximately 500 years after Uwan Muhujaj's mummification, the once lush savanna began to recede, succumbing to aridness. Driven eastwards in search of water, these people converged with another remarkable group from Central Africa at the Nile. This group, known for creating the 20,000-year-old Ishango bone, demonstrated a deep understanding of advanced math, including relationships between prime numbers. But that's a story for another day. A few millennia later, it is the descendants of these Western Sahara Africans that would create yet another remarkable nation, the Garamantes. The Garamantes were an ancient civilization that existed around 500 BCE to 700 CE. They lived in the Saharan region, in what is now modern-day Libya. Their civilization was centered around the Fezzan region, which was an oasis area crucial for survival in the harsh desert environment. The Garamantes were known for their advanced irrigation systems, which they used to channel water from underground aquifers to their fields, allowing them to practice agriculture in the desert. They grew crops like barley and wheat, and also raised livestock. They established a network of underground tunnels, known as fogaras, to transport water from aquifers to their farms. This innovative system showcased their ingenuity and ability to adapt to their challenging environment. The Garamantes played a crucial role in trade across the Sahara, connecting the Mediterranean world to the interior of Africa. They traded goods like ivory, ostrich feathers, and exotic animals from sub-Saharan Africa to the Roman and later Byzantine empires. Garamantes had superb constructions that were very Nubian-like. They built small pyramids and had elaborate town networks. Between 1 and 700 AD samples were gathered, showing cranial perforation, indicating advanced surgical knowledge. In the ancient text Claudius Ptolemy Geography, we clearly see that the Garamantes were black. And I quote, "Each of these statements, on the face of it, is incredible. First, because the Ethiopians are not so far distant from the Garamantes as to require 3 months' journey, seeing that the government is Edom themselves for the most part, Ethiopians, and have the same king." In Archaeology of the Fezzan, C.M. Daniels shows that, quote, "Garamantes cluster mostly to sub-Saharan African and secondarily to Roman Egyptians from Alexandria and Nubians." Here, I would like to remind you that Egyptians are in whole black. This means that the Garamantes were in totality black. Again, this is not surprising as prehistoric North Africans have been shown to be black. It is not until the Muslim invasion in the 7th and 8th century AD that the genetic makeup of North Africa starts to transform. It isn't just on the west coast of the Mediterranean that black people started classical civilization, but also in the east coast. And Africans had an important influence in the start of this civilization, to which the modern world attributes so much. Often overstated, Greek contribution should, however, be looked at within the context of those who taught them language, writing, art, science, and religion. Not once, but many times over. Yet still, the classical view of the Aegean civilization goes as follows. The earliest known civilization in Greece was the Minoan civilization, which emerged on the island of Crete around 2700 BCE. The Mycenaean civilization followed, beginning around 1600 BCE and lasting until around 1100 BCE. The period of ancient Greece, commonly referred to as Classical Greece, lasted from the 5th century BCE to the 4th century CE, and is credited with giving us philosophy, democracy, literature, art and architecture, mathematics, sciences, and Olympic Games. This is the narrative that we have all been taught. However, Greek history is far more interesting when you take into account what the Greeks themselves said about the origin of their civilization and knowledge. Not only did the Greeks learn everything, and I mean everything they knew from the Africans in Kemet, but their civilization itself may have been started by the Africans.
The Egyptians were the teachers of the Greeks, and no one really considered the Greeks serious as philosophers, for instance, and Socrates and Plato and these people had transmitted elements of their philosophy. Both can be explained in terms of Egyptian borrowings. And I think this is just an example of a large proportion of the Greek vocabulary, in fact, is better explained in terms of Egyptian and Semitic borrowings.
Remember here that the Semitic language itself is a descendant of Afro-Asiatic, which has its root in the Niger-Congo language family. And the Greeks themselves attest to the fact that the Pelasgians started their civilization. They were the first people who later on, in 1600 BC, started the Mycenaean civilization. So the Pelasgians play a crucial role in the foundation of Greek civilization. Asius of Samos relates to us that, quote, Pelasgus was the godlike founder of the Pelasgians, and that from the black earth he came. End quote. Now, where in antiquity have we heard the term black earth before? You guessed it. It is exactly the appellation of the ancient Egyptian land, Kemet, which translates to both the Black Land and the Land of the Blacks. And there is an even larger classical civilization that was started by the Africans. One that people still talk about today as the greatest civilization in history after Egypt and Sumer. Rome is indebted to the Etruscans in the same way the Greek took almost all aspects of their civilization from Kemet, Egypt. The Etruscans lived between 800 and 300 BC in northern Italy. The Romans inherited the core elements of their civilization from the Etruscans. Before being displaced by the Romans, the Etruscans had already set the basis for the religion, art, and architecture that Rome would inherit. But it doesn't stop there. The Etruscans were known for their engineering prowess, particularly in the construction of roads and aqueducts, and the Romans adopted many of their engineering techniques, such as the use of drainage systems and underground tunnels. Even their writing system was the basis for the Roman alphabet. Unlike the Romans, the Etruscans were peaceful, but they were very technologically advanced. So who were these people that gave civilization to the Romans? And what did they look like? In his 2013 book, Black Origins of Ancient Rome, the German author Gert Müller explains how the black descendants of Kemet, ancient Egypt, created the sophisticated Etruscan civilization. Archaeological and genetic evidence shows that the black Etruscans were eventually displaced by the invading Romans, who inherited their technology and science. Described as dark-skinned Africans, the Etruscans venerated the African sun god Ra from Kemet, Egypt, and even had Egyptian-like tombs. The Etruscans were so advanced that even their sewage waterworks are a marvel of engineering surviving till this day. The Etruscans were eventually displaced by the Romans we know today. But in turn, there is another classic civilization that almost wiped out the Romans. And that civilization holds an important role in the history of African people, as it marks, in many's eyes, the turning point of civilization downturn for the Africans. We have seen how the majority of prehistory North Africa was black, or of ethnic groups indistinguishable from what we would call black Africans today. You can check our episode on Uan Mahujaj, the infant mummy in the Libyan desert. This is corroborated by the studies done by scholars who dug up remains from ancient Carthage. Their results showed that the elite were almost exclusively black, like the remains of this high priestess of Tani. Professor Eugene Pittard had this to say about the discovery, quote, "The woman buried there had Negro features. She belonged to the African race." End quote. This is also further corroborated by Professor Stéphane Zell, who stated, and I quote, "The so-called Semitic type, characterized by the long, perfectly oval face, the thin aquiline nose, and the lengthened cranium, enlarged over the nape of the neck, has not yet been found in Carthage." End quote. Carthage had been settled by Phoenicians as a city-state in North Africa, near the current Tunis. In his 1961 work, French historian Gabriel Audizio comments that he considered Hannibal to be a North African. The majority of the Punic populace seems to have had African, indeed Negroid ancestry. Whether described as Carthaginians, Phoenicians, or Punics of North Africa, according to Audizio's research, they were certainly a mix of ancient Nubian stock Aboriginal North Africans. Carthage had been settled by Phoenicians as a city-state in North Africa near the current Tunis. In his 1961 work, French historian Gabriel Audizio comments that he considered Hannibal to be a North African. The majority of the Punic populace seems to have had African, indeed Negroid, ancestry. Whether described as Carthaginians, Phoenicians, or Punics of North Africa, according to Audizio's research, they were certainly a mix of ancient Nubian stock Aboriginal North Africans. So then, one might ask, why is it that the Carthaginian illustration that we see online always depict white people and not even Asiatics, let alone black Africans, as the research shows that they were? Well, it is important to take into context the following facts. The majority of those depictions were made centuries after Carthage had ended as a civilization. Furthermore, those who did these illustrations were themselves European. It is only natural that they would paint this most successful of generals to their image. Lastly, those depictions of Hannibal that clearly show him as phenotypically black African are seldom, if ever, shared in history documentaries and books. And yet, when you look at the coins of Hannibal minted in Italy, this is what you see. When the Roman finally defeated the Carthaginians, they engaged in the most brutal and systematic eradication of a civilization that we may have ever witnessed in history. They made all effort to erase Carthage from the map and from history. The city, its people, its culture, its relics, they were all killed, burned, and reduced to rubble and sand. This may have contributed to the animosity that the Romans started to have towards the Africans, animosity that they also had towards the Germanic tribes due to their fierce resistance to Roman rule. When Scipio attacked Carthage in hopes that it would cause Hannibal to return home, the plan worked, shifting the theater of operation from the Italian peninsula to the North African coast. It is there, it is truly there, that the balance of civilization power set on the African and rose on the European continent. An unbroken line from the Natufians and the inventors of the Ashango bone front the Congo basin. To the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex and its many derivatives, including Sumer and the Phoenicians, to the Kushite, the Ethiopians, and the Carthaginians. This defeat, coupled with the accelerating climate change disaster that was now unfolding at full speed in the Sahara, caused mass famine and decline of civilizations all over Africa, a true population setback that would take millennia and introduction of new high-yield crops to address. It is at this symbolic moment that Africa's fortune changed, leaving behind it only echoes of its deeds, from religion to philosophy and mathematics, knowledge that it had ushered and shared to the then-known world, a fact that is now lost to most and for which we have to fight. History finally makes sense once the veil of racism is removed. What are you doing? You are 35 minutes into this video, and you haven't clicked the like button nor commented yet. Shame on you. Without the support from channel members, Patreon supporters, and Buy Me a Coffee members, this channel would not be possible. Let us know which part marked you the most, and stay tuned for part 2.